Hey everyone, I need some honest advice here because I'm honestly questioning everything right now. This situation has been eating at me for days, and I can't shake the feeling that something really unfair happened. My family thinks I'm being dramatic, but I feel like there's so much more going on beneath the surface. I'm going to share the whole story with you because I need outside perspective. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being selfish, but right now I feel like my heart has been completely shattered by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. This is about broken promises, family expectations, and what happens when you realize that maybe you weren't treated the same as your sibling. Growing up in the Martinez household meant living with big dreams and even bigger promises. My parents, Maria and Carlos, were the kind of people who believed in making memories that would last a lifetime. They had this beautiful love story themselves. They met at a community college, fell head over heels, and had what they always described as the most magical wedding day imaginable. Every Sunday after church, when we would sit around the kitchen table eating my mom's famous tres leches cake, the conversation would somehow always drift to weddings. Mom would get this dreamy look in her eyes and start talking about how incredible her wedding day had been. She would describe the way the sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of the old chapel, how her dress felt like it was made of clouds, and how she and Dad danced until their feet hurt. "Mija," she would say to me, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "your wedding day is going to be even more beautiful. We're going to make sure you have everything you've ever dreamed of." My little sister Sophia and I would sit there, completely mesmerized by these stories. Mom had this way of painting pictures with her words that made us both believe in fairy tales. She would tell us about the flowers that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, about the 3-tier cake that had been hand-decorated with sugar roses, about the mariachi band that had played until dawn. Dad would nod along, his eyes twinkling with the same excitement. "Your mother is absolutely right," he would say in his warm, gravelly voice. "We started saving for your weddings the day you were both born. No expense will be spared when the time comes." And they really meant it. Mom had these thick 3-ring binders, one for me and one for Sophia, filled with magazine clippings, vendor information, and handwritten notes about everything from table linens to flower arrangements. She would spend hours on Saturday mornings organizing these binders, adding new ideas she had found in bridal magazines or online. "Look at this, sweetheart." She would call me over to the dining room table where she had spread out pages of wedding inspiration. "What do you think about these centerpieces? Too much, not enough. We want everything to be absolutely perfect for your special day." The savings accounts were real too. Every month, without fail, Mom and Dad would deposit money into separate accounts labeled Wedding Fund Isabel and Wedding Fund Sophia. They would show us the bank statements sometimes, proud of how the numbers kept growing year after year. It became this beautiful family tradition that made both Sophia and me feel incredibly loved and valued. I remember being 16 and having one of those typical teenage moments where I was feeling sorry for myself about something completely trivial. Mom sat me down in her bedroom and pulled out my wedding binder. We spent the entire afternoon going through it page by page, updating ideas and talking about what my dream wedding would look like. "I want it to feel magical," I told her, sprawled across her bed while we looked through photos of wedding venues. "Like something out of a fairy tale, but also really personal and meaningful." "Then that's exactly what we'll give you, my Amber," Mom promised, marking notes in the margins of a magazine page. "Your father and I want nothing more than to see you walking down that aisle knowing that every single detail was chosen with love." Those moments with my mom were some of the most precious memories of my childhood. It wasn't just about the wedding planning, it was about feeling completely supported and cherished by my parents. They were investing in our happiness in such a tangible way, and it made both Sophia and me feel like we were truly priorities in their lives. Sophia and I would sometimes sit in her room and plan our weddings together, sharing ideas and getting excited about how different but equally beautiful they would be. She always leaned toward more traditional elements. She loved the idea of a classic white dress, roses everywhere, and a formal sit-down dinner. I was drawn to something a bit more unique, maybe an outdoor ceremony, wildflowers, and a celebration that felt more like a joyful party than a formal event. But we both shared the same underlying dream, that our parents would be there, beaming with pride, having created something absolutely magical for us. We trusted completely in their promise that money would never be an object when it came to our wedding days. As I got older and started dating more seriously, these conversations became even more frequent and detailed. When I brought girlfriends home to meet the family, Mom would inevitably end up showing them my wedding binder. It was slightly embarrassing, but also really sweet. She was so excited about the possibility of planning my dream wedding that she couldn't contain herself. "Your daughter is going to have the most beautiful wedding," she would tell my girlfriends with absolute confidence. "We've been planning for this day since she was born." Looking back now, I realize how much those promises shaped my expectations and dreams. For over 20 years, I had been building up this vision of my wedding day, and my parents had been right there encouraging every detail of that vision. They had made it clear that this was going to be one of the most important investments they would ever make, and that our happiness was worth any financial sacrifice. So when I met Sarah 3 years ago and knew she was the one I wanted to spend my life with, the first thing I felt after the joy and excitement was this incredible anticipation about finally getting to use that wedding binder. Finally, all those years of planning and saving were going to pay off in the most beautiful way possible. Meeting Sarah changed everything for me. She had this way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special, like when she would bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, or how she would leave little notes in my lunch bag before work. She was kind, funny, intelligent, and she loved my family almost as much as I did. More importantly, she loved me exactly as I was, without any conditions or expectations. We had been together for about 18 months when we started talking seriously about marriage. It wasn't one of those dramatic proposal moments you see in movies. It was more like a series of conversations where we both realized that we couldn't imagine our futures without each other. We talked about everything: our career goals, whether we wanted children, how we would handle finances, and yes, what kind of wedding we wanted. "I've been dreaming about this day since I was little," I told Sarah one evening as we sat on our apartment balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset. "My parents have been planning for it too. They have this whole binder full of ideas, and they've been saving money for years specifically for my wedding." Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement. "Really? That's incredible. Most parents these days expect their kids to pay for their own weddings. Your family sounds amazing." "They really are," I agreed, feeling that familiar warm glow that came with talking about my parents' generosity. "They always said that our wedding days would be the most important investment they'd ever make. I can't wait for you to see all the ideas Mom has collected over the years." When I finally worked up the courage to propose to Sarah with a ring that had taken me 6 months to save, for her immediate reaction after saying yes was to ask when we could sit down with my parents to start planning. She was just as excited as I was about the prospect of having this dream wedding that had been years in the making. "I want to call my parents right now and tell them," I said, practically bouncing with excitement as Sarah admired her ring. "Wait," she laughed, catching my hand before I could grab my phone. "Let's just sit with this moment for a few minutes. We're engaged. We're actually going to get married." We spent the rest of that evening just holding each other and talking about our future together. But underneath all the joy and excitement, I was already mentally going through that wedding binder, thinking about which venues we should visit first and wondering if Mom had found any new ideas since the last time we had looked through it together. The next morning, I called my parents and asked if Sarah and I could come over for dinner. I wanted to tell them about our engagement in person, and I was practically vibrating with anticipation about finally getting to start planning the wedding we had all been dreaming about for so long. When we arrived at my parents' house that evening, Mom immediately knew something was up. She has always had this incredible intuition when it comes to her children, and the smile on my face was probably giving everything away. "Okay, what's going on?" she demanded before we had even sat down in the living room. "You look like you're about to burst with some kind of news." I looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly, and then I took a deep breath. "Mom, Dad, Sarah, and I are engaged." The reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. Mom literally screamed with joy and immediately pulled both of us into the biggest hug imaginable. Dad's eyes filled with tears as he shook Sarah's hand and welcomed her officially to the family. It was one of those perfect moments that you want to freeze and keep forever. But then, after the initial celebration had died down, something unexpected happened. Instead of immediately pulling out the wedding binder and starting to make plans, my parents exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. Mom's smile faltered for just a moment, and Dad cleared his throat in that way he does when he's trying to figure out how to say something difficult. Mija, Dad said slowly, we need to talk about the wedding situation. I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to stay positive. Maybe they wanted to discuss logistics or set a timeline or talk about budget parameters. Of course, I can't wait to start planning. Should we get the binder? Mom and Dad exchanged another look, and this time I could definitely tell that something was wrong. Mom sat down heavily in her favorite armchair, and Dad moved to stand behind her with his hands on her shoulders. The thing is, sweetheart, Mom began, her voice much quieter than it had been moments before, things have been really difficult for us financially over the past few years. The COVID pandemic hit our business harder than we ever could have imagined, and then with inflation and everything else that's been happening with the economy, she trailed off, and Dad picked up where she had left off. What your mother is trying to say is that we're not in the same financial position we were in when we made those promises about your wedding. We've had to use most of the money we had saved to keep the business afloat and maintain our mortgage payments. I felt like someone had just punched me in the stomach. Sarah reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently as she sensed my shock and disappointment. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you saying exactly? We're saying that we can't afford to give you the dream wedding we always talked about, Mom said, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. We are so sorry, Isabel. If there was any way we could make it work, we would, but we just can't take on that kind of financial burden right now. The room fell completely silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. I stared at my parents, trying to process what they had just told me. 20+ years of promises, planning, and preparation, and now they were telling me that none of it was possible anymore. But, I started, then stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. But what about all those years of saving? But what about the binders and the planning and the promises? But what about the fact that you told me my entire life that this was one of your biggest priorities? Sarah squeezed my hand again and spoke up. We completely understand that things have been difficult. Maybe we could just scale back the original plans. We don't need anything extravagant. We just want to celebrate with family and friends. Mom nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that Sarah was being so understanding. Yes, exactly. You could have a beautiful, intimate ceremony. Sometimes those are even more meaningful than the big, elaborate affairs. I wanted to be understanding. I wanted to be mature and reasonable and recognize that my parents were dealing with real financial hardships. But I also felt like something fundamental had been broken, a promise that had shaped my expectations and dreams for my entire adult life. Okay, I said finally, because I didn't know what else to say. We'll figure something out. The months that followed were a whirlwind of budget, wedding planning, and constant compromises. Sarah and I threw ourselves into finding ways to create something beautiful and meaningful within our very limited budget. We researched DIY decorations, looked into non-traditional venues, and asked friends and family members to help with various aspects of the celebration. My parents tried to be supportive in their own way. Mom would occasionally offer suggestions for ways to save money, and Dad helped us transport supplies when we found good deals at wholesale stores. But the elaborate wedding binder remained tucked away somewhere, and we never talked about all those years of planning and promises that had suddenly become impossible to fulfill. The wedding we ended up having was actually quite lovely in its own way. We got married in a small community garden that we were able to rent for a fraction of what a traditional venue would have cost. Sarah looked absolutely radiant in a simple but elegant dress she had found on sale, and I wore a suit that I had borrowed from my cousin. Our friends contributed homemade dishes for the reception, and my aunt, who used to be a florist, helped us create beautiful but budget-friendly centerpieces. But even though our wedding day was filled with love and joy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Every time I looked around at our small, simple celebration, I couldn't help but think about all those magazine pages in Mom's binder and all those years of being told that no expense would be spared for my special day. Sarah never complained, not even once. She told everyone who would listen that our wedding had been perfect exactly as it was, and that she wouldn't have changed a single thing about it. She was genuinely happy with how everything had turned out, which made me feel even worse about my own lingering disappointment. I loved that our wedding was so personal and intimate, she would say when people asked about it. It really felt like it was about our love and our commitment to each other, not about impressing anyone or putting on a show. And she was right, of course. Our wedding had been about love and commitment, but it had also been a constant reminder that my parents' financial situation had forced us to give up on dreams that had been decades in the making. I tried to put those feelings behind me and focus on building my life with Sarah. We moved into a larger apartment, adopted a rescue dog, and started talking about our long-term goals as a married couple. I threw myself into my work and tried not to think too much about wedding binders and broken promises. But then, about 6 months after our wedding, Sophia dropped a bombshell that changed everything. She had been dating her boyfriend Marcus for about 2 years, and they had been talking about getting engaged for several months. Sophia had always been the type of person who planned everything carefully and methodically, so it wasn't surprising that she wanted to have a long engagement to properly plan her wedding. When she called to tell me that Marcus had finally proposed, I was genuinely excited for her. Sophia and Marcus were perfect for each other. They shared the same values, the same sense of humor, and the same dreams for their future together. If anyone deserved a beautiful wedding celebration, it was my little sister. "I'm so happy for you," I told her during our phone conversation. "Have you and Marcus talked about what kind of wedding you want?" "Actually," Sophia said, and I could hear the excitement bubbling up in her voice, "we're going out to dinner with Mom and Dad tomorrow night to start talking about planning." I know things have been tight for them financially, but Marcus and I have been saving money too, so hopefully we can figure out something beautiful together. I felt a little pang of something, not jealousy exactly, but maybe wistfulness as I listened to her talk about the planning process that Sarah and I had never really gotten to experience. But I pushed those feelings aside and focused on being a supportive older sister. "That's wonderful," I said. "I'm sure Mom is already getting the binder out and starting to make lists." Sophia laughed. "You know her so well, she's probably been waiting for this moment since the day I was born." The next evening, Sarah and I were invited to join the family dinner where Sophia and Marcus would start discussing their wedding plans. I was looking forward to seeing everyone and celebrating this exciting milestone in my sister's life. But what happened that night changed everything I thought I knew about my parents' financial situation. We all met at Mom and Dad's favorite restaurant, the same place where they had celebrated their own anniversary every year for as long as I could remember. Sophia and Marcus looked radiantly happy, and Mom and Dad seemed more excited than I had seen them in months. After we had ordered our meals and caught up on everyone's news, the conversation naturally turned to wedding planning. I expected this to be a careful discussion about budgets and realistic expectations, similar to the conversation Sarah and I had experienced. Instead, Mom reached into her purse and pulled out Sophia's wedding binder, the same type of thick, organized collection of ideas and inspiration that had been such a big part of my childhood. "Okay, Mija," Mom said, her voice full of the same excitement I remembered from when I was younger. "Let's start talking about your dream wedding. We want this to be absolutely perfect for you." I watched in shock as Mom opened the binder and started showing Sophia and Marcus page after page of elaborate ideas. She talked about venues that would cost thousands of dollars to rent, catering options that would require hiring professional staff, flowers that would need to be specially ordered months in advance. "We were thinking we could look at that beautiful vineyard about an hour outside the city," Mom continued, showing them photos she had printed out. "They do these incredible outdoor ceremonies with string lights and live music. It would be absolutely magical." Marcus looked a little overwhelmed by the scope of what Mom was describing. "Mrs. Martinez, this all sounds incredible, but are you sure it's realistic budget-wise? Sophia and I don't want you and Mr. Martinez to overextend yourselves financially." Dad waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the budget, son. We've been saving for this day since Sophia was born. We want to give her everything she's ever dreamed of." I felt like I was living in some kind of alternate reality. These were almost the exact same words my parents had used to describe my wedding planning for over 20 years. But when it had come time for my wedding, suddenly the money wasn't available and we needed to be realistic about our expectations. Sarah must have sensed my shock and confusion because she reached under the table and squeezed my leg gently. I looked at her and saw concern in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. The conversation continued for another hour, with Mom and Dad enthusiastically discussing details that would have cost more than Sarah and I had spent on our entire wedding. They talked about hiring a professional photographer, ordering a custom cake from the most expensive bakery in town, and even bringing in a live band for the reception. By the time we left the restaurant, Sophia had a timeline for venue visits and vendor meetings that stretched over the next several months. Mom and Dad seemed absolutely thrilled to be planning another wedding, and Sophia looked like she was walking on air, but I felt like I had been punched in the stomach all over again. That night, Sarah and I drove home in almost complete silence. I could tell she was processing everything we had just witnessed, just as I was trying to make sense of what had just happened. The contrast between Sophia's wedding planning conversation and our own experience was so stark that it felt like we were talking about two completely different families. "Are you okay?" Sarah finally asked as we pulled into our driveway. I sat in the car for a moment, staring straight ahead and trying to organize my thoughts. "I don't understand what just happened in there. 6 months ago, my parents told us they couldn't afford to help with our wedding because of COVID and the economy. Tonight, they're talking about spending tens of thousands of dollars on Sophia's wedding like money is no object." Sarah reached over and took my hand. "Maybe their financial situation has improved recently. Sometimes businesses can turn around pretty quickly when the economy starts recovering." I wanted to believe that explanation, but something deep in my gut told me that wasn't the whole story. The way my parents had talked tonight with such confidence and enthusiasm about spending money didn't sound like people whose financial situation had dramatically improved in just 6 months. It sounded like people who had always had the money but had chosen not to spend it on my wedding for reasons they weren't being honest about. "I need to talk to them," I said. "I need to understand what's really going on." The next day, I called Mom and asked if I could stop by after work. I told her I wanted to talk about Sophia's wedding planning, which was technically true, though not the whole truth about what I wanted to discuss. When I arrived at my parents' house, Mom was in the kitchen making dinner and humming to herself. She seemed to be in an incredibly good mood, probably still riding the high from the previous night's wedding planning session. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, giving me a big hug. "I'm so excited about Sophia's wedding. Did you see how happy she looked last night? We're going to give her the wedding of her dreams." "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about," I said, sitting down at the kitchen table where we had shared so many conversations over the years. "Mom, I'm confused about something and I need you to help me understand." She turned away from the stove and looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression. "Of course, Mija, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath and tried to choose my words carefully. "Last night, you and Dad were talking about Sophia's wedding like money isn't an issue at all. You were discussing venues and vendors that would cost thousands and thousands of dollars. But when Sarah and I got engaged, you told us that the business had been struggling and you couldn't afford to help with our wedding." Mom's expression immediately changed. The cheerful, excited look disappeared and was replaced by something much more guarded. "Isabel, I think you're misunderstanding the situation." "What am I misunderstanding?" I pressed. "Either you have money for weddings or you don't. Either the business recovered from COVID or it didn't. I'm just trying to figure out what changed between my wedding and Sophia's wedding." Mom turned back to the stove and started stirring something vigorously, even though it probably didn't need stirring. "Maybe it's for the best that you had a more intimate wedding, considering the circumstances." "What circumstances?" I asked, feeling my heart rate starting to increase. "What circumstances are you talking about?" She shrugged and continued stirring. "You know, just the circumstances." I stared at her back, feeling a cold dread starting to settle in my stomach. "Mom, please just be honest with me." "What circumstances?" But she wouldn't answer. She just kept cooking and acting like I hadn't asked her a direct question. After a few more attempts to get her to explain what she meant, I gave up and went home feeling more confused and hurt than ever. 2 weeks later, Sophia approached me about being her maid of honor. We were at a family barbecue, and she pulled me aside while everyone else was busy with the grill and the various side dishes. "Isabel, I have something really important to ask you," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Would you be my maid of honor? I can't imagine having anyone else standing beside me on my wedding day." Under normal circumstances, I would have been thrilled and honored to be asked. Sophia and I had always been close, despite our 4-year age difference, and I loved her dearly. But given everything that had been happening with the wedding planning situation, I found myself feeling hurt and resentful instead of excited. Sophia, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I need to be honest with you about something. I don't think I can be your maid of honor, and I don't think I can even come to your wedding. Her face fell immediately. What, Isabel, what are you talking about? Of course you're coming to my wedding. You're my sister. I can't watch Mom and Dad give you everything they promised me but never delivered, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. For over 20 years, they told me that my wedding would be their top priority and that no expense would be spared. Then, when it was time for my wedding, suddenly there was no money. Now, 6 months later, they're planning to spend a fortune on your wedding like nothing ever happened. Sophia stared at me in shock. Isabel, you can't be serious. You're going to miss your own sister's wedding because you're jealous? I'm not jealous, I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was entirely true. I'm hurt, I'm confused. And I can't pretend to be happy about something that feels so unfair. This is ridiculous, Sophia said, her voice getting louder. You're being completely selfish and making my wedding about you. Grow up, Isabel. That conversation ended with both of us walking away angry and hurt. Sophia didn't speak to me for several days, and when she finally did, it was only to tell me through a text message that she had decided not to ask me to be her maid of honor after all. But there was something else in that text message that made my blood run cold. She wrote, I've decided I don't feel comfortable being responsible for managing your big day when you're already so upset about everything. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. I read that message over and over again, trying to understand what she meant. What did she mean by being responsible for managing my big day? What big day was she referring to? And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Sophia was talking about when she had been asked to be my maid of honor for my wedding to Sarah. She was admitting that she had turned down being my maid of honor because she didn't feel comfortable with it. I had never told anyone in my family how hurt I had been when Sophia declined to be my maid of honor. At the time, she had given me some vague excuse about being too busy with work and school, and I had tried to be understanding. But now I was realizing that her real reason had been that she didn't want to be associated with my wedding because I was already upset about the budget situation. My own sister had abandoned me during one of the most important moments of my life because she didn't want to deal with my disappointment about my parents' broken promises. The final straw came when I decided to have one last conversation with Mom about what was really going on. I couldn't let this situation continue without getting some honest answers, even if those answers were painful to hear. Mom, I said when I called her, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me an honest answer. Is the reason you didn't help pay for my wedding because I'm gay? There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, then Mom sighed heavily. Isabel, don't play the gay card with me, she said, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it before. If you're not adult enough to understand that we simply couldn't afford it at the time, then maybe we need to reconsider whether you're mature enough to inherit the family business someday. I felt like she had just slapped me across the face. Not only was she refusing to give me an honest answer, but she was now threatening my future inheritance as a way to shut down the conversation. The gay card, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom, I'm asking you a legitimate question about why my sister is getting the dream wedding that you promised me for over 20 years. We've already discussed this, Isabel. The circumstances were different when you got married. I don't understand why you can't just be happy for your sister instead of making everything about yourself. That was the moment I realized that I was never going to get the truth from my parents. Whatever their real reasons were for treating Sophia's wedding so differently from mine, they were never going to admit it openly. And my sister, who should have been my ally and support system, had instead chosen to distance herself from me when I needed her most. As I hung up the phone, I made a decision that I knew would probably damage my family relationships permanently. I wasn't going to attend Sophia's wedding. I couldn't sit there and watch my parents celebrate her with the same enthusiasm and financial support they had denied me, while pretending that everything was fair and normal. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it also felt like the only way to protect my own emotional well-being and maintain some sense of dignity in an impossible situation.